A Lifetime of Impossible Days by Tabitha Bird. This was a bit of a rocky road read for me. It was definitely not all jam, drops and tea. In terms of reading, well, arguably I didn't. I listened to it and the narrator did a marvellous job. But in terms of the story itself, I ended up giving it a 4 stars out of 5. But in terms of reading experience, it started off cruising along at a 3 or 4. It sunk to 2 for a very long time. And there was a point where I almost gave up on it, and it nearly ended up on the did not finish shelf. Because during parts of it, I found it vastly annoying. It seems to be a polarizing book. It's one of the magic realism books that people either love or hate, not so much in between. I'm more in between on it. The ending was incredibly good, and the last couple of chapters kind of redeemed it. The ending definitely redeemed it. And unexpectedly so, which is kind of what you expect in a book that is about the unexpected or indeed the impossible. So the narration. I don't think I could have made it through this book without the narration. In my own head, the voices probably would not have sounded as good as this narrator did. Who is the narrator, by the way? Oh well, whoever the narrator was. She was really good. No higher praise, because normally I prefer the voices inside my head to the voices on the audiobook, and I tend to be quite critical of them. I chose this book for the magical realism that I thought it was going to be. And it is very much a magical realism book, but at times I felt the story lost its way a bit. We start off in 2050 with an old lady called Willa Waters and her live-in carer Cat. They're walking to the post office with Willa stomping along in her gumboots, teasing her carer, not very kindly. We understand early on that Willa's memory is very old. One can't help thinking dementia at times, because she barely seems to know who she is or what she's doing from minute to minute, and has no idea whatsoever who anyone else is. The past is a misty mystery for her, from which things real and unreal poke up like iceberg memories. Now, I really, really liked the character of silver-haired Willa. She never grew old, it was always consistent, and it was always enjoyable. As I'm getting more silver hair myself, I'm finding that there's not enough enjoyable characters who are older rather than younger. Fiction and magical realism tend to favour the young, and so I was quite delighted by silver-haired Willa, and so I was a bit nonplussed when we skipped back into the past, 2 other pasts of Willa's. One is 80-year-old and one is a 30-year-old. And at first I thought it was going to be one of those dread books where the whole narrative skips back and forth in time like a psychotic time machine. And I don't like them, and I usually don't have any patience for them, and I very often give up on them. Well, it is and it isn't. It doesn't have the frenetic pace of some of the books that skip time, but it does skip time, that's real. But the time skipping is the story itself, rather than a mechanism to tell you about the person. So it actually worked very well. It was a nice device, and it was well done. Very rarely well done device, can I say. Some of the story is pretty strongly in the trigger warning zone. I'll just mention that now. You've got domestic abuse, which is pretty graphic, and child abuse, which is implied rather than graphic. I'd also add a bit of warning for some of the mental states that those kinds of abuse can induce. They were convincing. Now, the thing that drew me to the book, the magic realism, that I thought would be a major part of the story, it was more of a facilitator, and that disappointed me for quite a while. I also did not love the child Willa or the middle-aged Willa as much as I liked the old Willa. I was impatient with middle Willa, who couldn't make a single decision on her own. She was annoying almost the whole time. Child Willa, Super Gumboot Willa, as she known as, I was pretty meh about, though she could be very annoying at times too. My interest was engaged, though, enough to overcome those other two characters that we saw more of and which I liked less. The fact became obvious that when the past changes, so does the older Willa's present. So the actual world that we started with, 2050, would change when something happened back then. And that was really intriguing. So for a while there, with middle Willa being OCD crazy, I did wonder if the big reveal at the end was going to be that silver-haired Willa, it was all dementia, delusional dementia, and that would have really annoyed me. Didn't happen, yay. Then at some point, the magical realism factor kicks in, and it's not obvious at the start. When it finally comes about, what it is a mysterious box containing a jar of water and the instruction, one ocean plant in the backyard. And that's the magical realism, because when planted, it becomes an ocean. And I really loved that theory. I loved the mango tree in the backyard. I loved the ocean that was planted. I loved everything that it created. And I was a bit sad later on in the book when the ocean stopped being a factor and just became a mechanism, a facilitator for the Willas to go back and forth in time. I still think that the ocean under the mango tree could and should have been a bigger part. So at the end of the day, this seems to be a book about abuse and healing from abuse, and it's lovely in that regard. It does it well. Very nicely done. The experiences of the child growing up in a very abusive family are the key to the whole story, really. The magic realism is less pronounced than I was hoping, but still it's a charming concept. The ending was excellent. A book that is kind of meh through most of its centre. Sort of like a 2-star read. A few times I picked it up and I could even barely be bothered with it. I think I moved on to another book that I read side by side with this one. And yet the ending was so good that it left me with a feeling of joy of having read it. So hooray for that. Well done. It was also a little bit less quirky. Magic realism these days is the thing. I mean, magic realism's always been there, but we usually used to call it fantasy or fiction, or sometimes science fiction and fantasy. But magic realism as a theme was always there. Now that it's become its own hashtag in its own right, it seems to necessarily feel that it has to be quirky. I feel that magic realism often loses out by having high levels of quirk, and the quirk in this one was absent. It was strong and relevant, I suppose, magical realism, rather than quirky and whimsical. So, yeah, a good book, which I hope I don't forget, but I really think I probably will, because I do that. Worth reading. Like, comment and subscribe. That's the YouTube thing I keep forgetting. Comment by any means. I love talking about books. Talk to me about books.